Somewhere, according to legend, there are tablets made of green stone that have survived longer than any pyramid, any temple, any civilization we can name. Not stone tablets covered in dust and cracked by time, but something stranger, slabs described as emerald, glowing faintly, carved with symbols that no ordinary hand could have made, holding a warning meant for us. A message written before the floods that mythology says drowned the old world. A message from someone who claims to have watched that world die. That someone is Thoth in ancient Egypt. Thoth wasn't just another face in a crowded pantheon. He was the god of writing itself, the inventor of hieroglyphs, the keeper of measurement, time and law. When the Egyptians needed to explain how knowledge entered the world, they pointed to him. When they needed to weigh a soul in the afterlife, he was the one holding the scale and recording the verdict. If wisdom had a source in Egyptian belief, it flowed from Thoth's hand. So when texts began circulating that claimed to be his personal writings, tablets he supposedly created and hid away for future generations to find, people paid attention. These texts describe Atlantis. They describe a cataclysm. They describe cycles of destruction and rebirth stretching back tens of thousands of years, long before anything we'd call recorded history. They read like a survivor's account of the end of a world, left behind as a warning for the next one, ours. And here's where things get complicated, because that's exactly what this investigation is going to untangle. Are these emerald tablets an authentic artifact from deep antiquity, something that actually traces back to ancient Egyptian belief? Are they a modern creation, dressed up in old language and older gods to feel more convincing than they really are? Or are they something in between, a blend of genuine ancient ideas filtered through centuries of translation, reinterpretation, and outright invention, until the line between original and imagined completely disappears? That's the real mystery here, not just what the tablets say, but where they actually come from, and whether the ancient Egyptian warning they claim to be is ancient at all. To answer that, we're going to have to go further than most retellings ever bother to go. We'll trace Thoth back to his real place in Egyptian religion, long before he was ever linked to hidden tablets or lost continents. We'll follow the paper trail of these documents through the 20th century to find out who actually wrote them down and when. We'll look at what ancient Egypt genuinely believed about catastrophe, about chaos, about the world nearly ending and being remade, because that mythology is real and it's stranger than most people realize. And we'll set all of it against the flood stories told across Mesopotamia and across cultures scattered around the entire globe to see if there's a thread connecting them, or if we're just pattern matching our way into a story that was never really there. By the end, you'll know exactly what parts of this legend hold up under real historical scrutiny, and what parts were built much later by people who wanted the past to sound more mysterious than it actually was. Before we go further, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I read these comments constantly, and there's something genuinely nice about picturing all these different places at once. Someone in Cairo at midnight, someone in Toronto right as the sun comes up, all listening to the same story about a warning that supposedly outlived an entire civilization. And if stories like this are the kind of thing that helps you unwind or drift off, the best way to support what we're doing here is simple. Follow the shows on Spotify. Listen there when you can, and if you're enjoying it, leave a 5-star review. There's a link in the description that makes it easy. Now let's go back to where this story actually starts. Not with tablets, with a god. Here's the first problem. When people say the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, they usually think they're talking about one thing. A single object, a single text, a single continuous tradition stretching back to ancient Egypt. They are not. There are at least 2 completely different traditions hiding under that same name, separated by more than 1,000 years, written in different languages, serving completely different purposes, and mixed together so thoroughly in popular culture that most people have no idea they're actually looking at two unrelated stories wearing the same label. So before we go any further, we need to pull these apart, because if we don't, we're going to spend the rest of this investigation chasing a target that keeps changing shape. The first tradition is real, in the sense that it's a documented historical text with a traceable paper trail. It's called the Emerald Tablet, singular, sometimes known by its Latin name, Tabula Smaragdina. This is a short piece of alchemical writing, just a few paragraphs long, that begins circulating in the Arabic-speaking world sometime around the 8th or 9th century. It gets translated into Latin by the 12th century, and becomes one of the foundational texts of medieval and Renaissance alchemy. If you've ever heard the phrase "as above, so below," that phrase traces back to this document. It's dense, cryptic, symbolic, the kind of text that reads like a riddle wrapped around a secret. It talks about the sun and the moon, about one thing being born from another, about the transformation of matter into something higher and purer. Alchemists spent centuries trying to decode it, because they believed sincerely that hidden inside this short text was the formula for the philosopher's stone. That's tradition number 1, short, medieval, alchemical, attributed to a legendary figure named Hermes Trismegistus, who we'll get to properly later, because his story is its own tangled mess of Greek philosophy and Egyptian religion smashed together. But keep this fact in your head. The original Emerald Tablet is small. A page, maybe 2. Not a set of tablets. Not a library. Not an epic. Now here's tradition number 2, and this is where things get strange. In the early 20th century, a completely different text starts appearing, one that's dramatically longer, dramatically stranger, and claims a completely different origin. This one calls itself the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, the Atlantean. Note the plural, note the new middle name. This version isn't a short alchemical riddle anymore. It's an entire cosmology. It describes ancient Atlantis in detail, its cities, its technology, its downfall. It describes hidden chambers beneath the Great Sphinx of Giza. It describes Thoth himself as a survivor of Atlantis, who fled to Egypt after his homeland was destroyed, who lived for thousands of years, who eventually withdrew into some kind of hidden existence, guarding secret knowledge for a future age that would finally be ready to receive it. It talks about cycles of destruction stretching back tens of thousands of years. It reads less like a medieval alchemical riddle, and more like the opening chapters of a fantasy novel complete with lost civilizations, secret initiations, and warnings about cosmic cycles. These two things, the short medieval alchemical text and the sprawling 20th century Atlantean epic, get talked about online as if they're the same document with the same pedigree. They are not. One has a documented trail through Arabic and Latin manuscripts, going back over 1,000 years. The other appears, as far as anyone can verify, sometime in the early 1900s, with a specific person behind it whose name we'll get to when we trace the paper trail properly. But here's the thing. Even knowing that, it's easy to understand why people want to believe in the second version, because the second version comes packaged with exactly the kind of imagery that makes ancient mysteries irresistible. Green stone. Think about that phrase for a second. Not grey stone, not brown stone, not the colour of every temple wall and pyramid block we've ever excavated. Green, glowing, translucent, otherworldly green, the colour of things that don't belong to the ordinary physical world. Emerald evokes value, rarity, permanence. It suggests something crafted by hands more skilled than ours, using materials more precious than anything we quarry today. When someone tells you a tablet is made of emerald, your brain doesn't picture a museum artifact. It pictures treasure. It pictures magic. Then there's the claim of ancient inscriptions, symbols so old that no known language can fully translate them, symbols that supposedly encode knowledge beyond what any ordinary ancient scribe could have understood. That detail does something specific to the imagination. It suggests the text isn't just old, it's smarter than we are. It implies a source of knowledge that bypasses normal human history altogether, something handed down rather than developed, something discovered rather than written. And then the secret chamber, hidden beneath the Sphinx, sealed away for thousands of years, waiting to be found by someone worthy enough or lucky enough to stumble across it. This is one of the most seductive images in all of alternative history, because it turns archaeology into treasure hunting. It suggests that everything mainstream Egyptology has told us is incomplete, that there's a deeper truth still buried, literally, beneath the monuments we've already excavated 100 times over. Green stone, ancient inscriptions, secret chambers. Put those three ingredients together and you have a legend that practically writes itself, one that feels ancient the moment you hear it, regardless of when it was actually composed. That feeling, that instant sense of, this must be real, look how old and mysterious it sounds, is exactly what we have to be careful of. Because atmosphere is not evidence. A story can feel ancient and be thoroughly modern. A text can sound like it belongs to a lost civilization and still have a traceable author, a traceable publisher, a traceable date, stamped somewhere in the 20th century. The only way to know what we're actually dealing with is to stop asking how something feels and start asking where it came from, who wrote it down, when it first appears in the historical record, what language it was originally composed in, who claimed to have found it and under what circumstances. That's provenance. And provenance, unlike atmosphere, doesn't care how good a story sounds. It just asks for the paper trail. So that's what we're going to build next, starting with the god at the center of both traditions, the real Thoth, the one Egyptians actually worshipped for 3,000 years, long before anyone attached his name to Atlantis or emerald stone at all. So who was Thoth before he became an Atlantean immortal, an alchemical master, or the supposed author of secret emerald books? In ancient Egypt, his name was Djeuti. The Greeks later called him Thoth, and he was not some obscure god lurking at the edges of the pantheon. He was one of the great intellectual powers of Egyptian religion, the god of writing, calculation, language, records, measurement, the moon, sacred learning, the careful ordering of the universe itself. If you wanted to invent a legendary keeper of hidden knowledge, Thoth was almost too perfect a candidate. But the real ancient Egyptian Thoth is more interesting than the later legend, because his authority wasn't based on mysterious technology or lost continents. It was based on something Egypt considered even more important: the belief that reality could collapse into chaos if nobody kept the accounts straight. That sounds almost funny at first. A god of paperwork, a divine accountant, but in Egypt, counting was never just counting. Writing was never just writing. Measuring a field, recording a king's reign, calculating the movement of the moon, preserving the right words for a ritual. All of this was connected to Ma'at. Ma'at was one of the central ideas in Egyptian civilization. It meant truth, justice, balance, rightness, cosmic order, the proper state of a world in which the Nile rose when it should rise. The sun returned each morning, crops grew, courts judged fairly, temples performed their rituals, and the king did his job. The opposite of Ma'at was Isfet, disorder, falsehood, violence, confusion, the world coming apart at the seams. And Egypt knew exactly how fragile order could be. The Nile could fail, harvests could collapse, dynasties could fall. Foreign armies could arrive, a dead king could leave behind a succession crisis. One bad season could become famine. One political failure could become civil war. Their world looked stable because Egypt spent thousands of years building monuments out of stone. But the people living there knew stability was something you had to maintain, again and again, generation after generation. Thoth was one of the gods who made that maintenance possible. He was often shown with the head of an ibis, the long curved beak giving him an unmistakable silhouette. Sometimes he appeared as a baboon, another animal associated with him in Egyptian tradition. And these weren't random decorative choices. The Egyptians saw meaning everywhere. The ibis and the baboon belonged to a network of associations involving the moon, intelligence, ritual timing, and sacred observation. Thoth was deeply tied to the lunar cycle, the moon that waxes, fades, disappears, and returns. That made him a natural god of timekeeping, of months, of calendars, of the measured rhythm by which human life could stay aligned with the larger rhythm of the cosmos. Think about what that meant in an ancient agricultural civilization. You need to know when the river is rising, when to plant, when to harvest, when to hold festivals, when taxes are due, how long a king has ruled, how much grain has been collected, where one person's field ends and another person's begins after floodwaters have erased the boundaries. None of this is glamorous, but none of civilization works without it. Thoth ruled that world. He was called the master of divine words, the lord of sacred texts, the one who knew the proper names of things. And in ancient Egypt, names were power. To know the name of a god, a person, a place, or a dangerous force was not simply to possess information. It was to have a relationship with its essence. Words could protect. Words could heal. Words could invoke divine power. Words could preserve a person after death. This is why writing had such enormous weight. A written name could help sustain the dead. A damaged name could threaten their memory. Funerary texts placed in tombs could guide a person through the hazards of the afterlife. Temple inscriptions didn't just describe rituals in a real sense, they participated in making those rituals effective. To write the correct words was to anchor them in the world, and Thoth was the divine source behind that act. Egyptian scribes understood this better than anyone. They were not merely people who could read and write in a mostly non-literate society. They were administrators, record keepers, accountants, legal officials, teachers, copyists, temple personnel, and servants of the state. They tracked grain, labour, land, taxes, military supplies, inheritance, court decisions, and the endless flow of goods through palaces and temples. They copied hymns and medical texts. They preserved stories, wisdom literature, royal decrees, and spells for the dead. A scribe could make a kingdom legible to itself. And for Egyptian scribes, Thoth was their patron. There are ancient images of Thoth holding a writing palette and reed pen, recording what the gods decree. He appears in temple scenes beside kings, confirming royal acts and marking years. He is connected to the careful measurement of time and the proper performance of rites. In some traditions, he helps establish the universe through speech and intellect, not by smashing monsters or wielding a thunderbolt, but by knowing, naming, calculating, and recording. That is a very Egyptian kind of power, because to the Egyptians, the universe wasn't held together by brute force alone. It was held together by correct ritual, correct speech, correct measure. The sun had to travel its course. The dead had to be judged. The temples had to recite the words. The king had to uphold Mat. And somewhere in this immense, cosmic bureaucracy stood Thoth, making sure the record was accurate. His role in the judgment of the dead shows this perfectly. In the famous scene from the Book of the Dead, the heart of the deceased is weighed against the feather of Mat. The heart carries the moral truth of a person's life. If it is balanced, the dead person can move forward into a blessed afterlife. If it fails the test, the consequences are final, and Thoth is often there, standing beside the scales with palette in hand, writing down the result. Notice what he does not do. He isn't necessarily the judge delivering the verdict. He is the recorder, the witness, the one who ensures that the cosmic process is measured correctly and entered into the permanent account. No cheating, no lost paperwork, no convenient rewriting after death. This role made Thoth a god of truth in a very specific sense. Not truth as a vague feeling, truth as something weighed, spoken, written, checked, and preserved. Truth as the difference between order and catastrophe. So now you can see why later writers looked at Thoth and saw the ideal guardian of secret wisdom. Take a god associated with writing, give him the moon and the calendar. Make him master of language, divine records, sacred books, and cosmic measurement. Place him beside the scales in the court of the dead. Connect him to the preservation of Ma'at itself. Then carry his image forward through centuries of Greek interpretation, Egyptian priestly lore, alchemical speculation, and modern occult imagination. Pretty quickly, the god who records divine knowledge becomes the god who possesses all knowledge. The god who guards sacred texts becomes the author of forbidden texts. The god who measures time becomes an immortal witness to ages beyond history. The god associated with hidden ritual language becomes the keeper of secrets buried beneath pyramids, temples, and deserts. You can almost watch the legend assembling itself. But this is where the distinction matters. Ancient Egyptian religion absolutely gives us a Thoth connected to sacred knowledge. It gives us Thoth, the scribe of the gods, Thoth, the reckoner of time, Thoth, the guardian of language, Thoth, the recorder of judgment, Thoth, the defender of cosmic order. These are not inventions. They are deeply rooted in Egyptian texts, temple traditions, and religious imagery across millennia. What it does not give us is archaeological evidence for physical emerald tablets written by Thoth. No excavated Egyptian text identifies a set of greenstone tablets as Thoth's Atlantean teachings. No ancient Egyptian inscription tells us that Thoth fled a drowned civilization and brought advanced knowledge to the Nile Valley. No verified cache beneath the Sphinx has produced an emerald archive. And no known Egyptian manuscript gives us the long Atlantean narrative found in the modern Emerald Tablets of Thoth. That doesn't make Thoth unimportant. It explains why his name was so powerful. A legend does not need to be ancient in every detail to draw on ancient material. It can take a real god, preserve the atmosphere of his authority, borrow the language of sacred writing and hidden wisdom, then build something entirely new around it. That is exactly the kind of process we're dealing with here. Thoth supplied the credentials. Later centuries supplied the secret books. And once we separate those two things, the next question becomes unavoidable. If the long emerald tablets are not an identifiable text from pharaonic Egypt, when do they actually enter the historical record? Who first put these words on paper? And how did a god of sacred writing become attached to one of the most famous lost civilization stories of the modern age? The answer turns out to be much closer than buried chambers beneath the Sphinx. Much closer than Atlantis. Much closer, in fact, than ancient Egypt. The modern text called the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, the Atlantean, enters the historical record in the early 20th century. Not on a papyrus excavated from a tomb, not carved on a temple wall, not recovered from a sealed Egyptian cache with an archaeological report, a site number, photographs, conservators, and a chain of custody. It appears in print in English through the world of American esoteric religion. The name most closely connected to it is Maurice Doreal. Maurice Doreal was the public name used by Claude Doggins, an American occult teacher active in the first half of the 20th century. He founded or led an organization called the Brotherhood of the White Temple, based in Colorado Springs, Colorado. This was part of a much larger spiritual environment that had been growing for decades. Theosophy, Rosicrucianism, Hermetic revival movements, mystical Christianity, reincarnation teachings, ancient master traditions, lost continent speculation, and the belief that hidden wisdom had survived from forgotten ages. This was the era when Atlantis was everywhere, not just in novels and adventure stories, but in serious-seeming spiritual systems. Helena Blavatsky's theosophy had already popularized enormous prehistoric cycles, vanished continents, spiritually advanced ancient races, and secret teachers guiding humanity from behind the scenes. Writers such as Ignatius Donnelly had turned Atlantis into a subject of popular historical speculation. Egypt, with its monuments, mummies, hieroglyphs, and immense age, became the perfect setting for these ideas. It looked ancient enough to hold any secret people wanted to find, and Thoth fit perfectly into that world. A god of writing becomes the keeper of an ancient record. A god of sacred knowledge becomes an initiate who remembers civilizations before recorded history. A god connected with measurement and cosmic order becomes the guardian of laws supposedly carried over from a lost world. By the time Doreal introduced his version of the tablets, the basic ingredients were already waiting. Egypt, Atlantis, hidden chambers, immortal masters, lost science, spiritual evolution, catastrophe, humanity forgetting what it once knew. Put them together, and you get a story that feels like it has been waiting underground for thousands of years. Doreal's text presents itself as a translation of ancient tablets attributed to Thoth the Atlantean. In its story, Thoth is not simply the Egyptian god known from temples and funerary texts. He is a figure from Atlantis, a master who survived the destruction of that lost civilization, travelled to Egypt, and became a guide to later humanity. The tablets describe hidden halls beneath the earth, the mysterious land of Amenti, beings of light and darkness, cycles of rise and collapse, and warnings about knowledge used without wisdom. It is a powerful mythic package. But now comes the question historians have to ask, and it is not a hostile question. It is the most basic question in the study of any old document. Where is the object if a text is presented as the translation of an ancient artifact? Historians want to know what material the artifact is made from, where it was found, who found it, when it was found, what excavation produced it, which museum, archive, university, or collection examined it, whether the language on it has been studied by trained epigraphers, whether independent experts can inspect it, whether there are photographs, drawings, chemical tests, ownership records, or even a reliable description from before the translation was published. For the Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean, that independent trail does not exist. Doreal gave accounts of the tablets being ancient greenstone records connected to Egypt and hidden places of great antiquity, but the physical tablets themselves were not made available for scholarly examination. No independently verified archaeological provenance has been established. No recognized Egyptian excavation has produced them. No museum catalogue records a set of Atlantean tablets inscribed by Thoth. No corpus of ancient Egyptian texts includes the long English narrative that appears in the modern work. And that matters. It does not prove that every spiritual idea in the text is meaningless. It does not prove that readers cannot find value in its imagery. But it does mean that the claim of ancient Egyptian authorship cannot be treated as established history. A text's age is not determined by how old it sounds. You can write, "I am Thoth, the master of wisdom," and immediately create the atmosphere of a voice speaking from before the pyramids. You can use formal language, cosmic warnings, repeated invocations, ancient names, references to stars and temples and underground halls. You can make the speaker sound immortal, but atmosphere is not evidence. And this is exactly why the tablets are so fascinating. They are not written in ancient Egyptian. They are not preserved in Coptic, Greek, Demotic, Hieratic or hieroglyphic script. They appear in modern English using a vocabulary shaped by 20th century occult thought. Terms and ideas within them often resemble the spiritual language circulating in Doriel's own world. Vibrations, cosmic forces, hidden masters, spiritual ascent, ancient races, initiates, secret chambers, and humanity moving through vast cycles of development and decline. That doesn't mean every single theme is new. Far from it. Ancient Egypt really did have ideas about sacred knowledge, cosmic order, divine speech, death, rebirth, chaos, and the dangerous power of forgetting the right rituals. Greek and Roman writers really did connect Thoth with Hermes. Late antique Hermetic writings really did imagine ancient divine wisdom preserved in secret teachings. Medieval and early modern alchemists really did speak of an emerald tablet, although that is a different text with a different history. But the modern tablets of Thoth combine these streams into something new. Think of it like an ancient river receiving tributaries. One tributary is Egyptian religion, Thoth, Ma'at, the underworld, temple wisdom, sacred words. Another is Greek and Roman Hermeticism, Hermes Trismegistus, hidden teachings, ancient priests, cosmic correspondences. Another is alchemy, the famous idea of an emerald tablet containing condensed secret knowledge. Another is theosophy and modern occultism, Atlantis, ascended masters, spiritual evolution, prehistoric catastrophe, secret brotherhoods, and the claim that humanity has forgotten a higher ancient civilization. By the time those tributaries meet in Doriel's work, the water may look ancient. But the river has taken a modern course. This is why historians do not classify the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, the Atlantean, as an authenticated document from pharaonic Egypt. There is no verified ancient manuscript, no securely dated artifact, no known Egyptian original, no archaeological context, no independent translation process, and no evidence that ancient Egyptians knew Thoth as a surviving Atlantean king who left behind this particular set of teachings. The historical classification, then, is fairly straightforward. The text belongs to modern esoteric literature, probably emerging in published form during the 1930s, and becoming widely circulated in editions associated with Doriel and the Brotherhood of the White Temple around the middle of the 20th century. That conclusion can feel disappointing if you came looking for a message carved before the flood. But it may actually make the story more revealing, because the tablets did not become influential simply by pretending to be old. They became influential because they answered a modern hunger. They offered readers a world in which history had a hidden depth, in which ancient disaster had not erased all wisdom, in which knowledge survived in secret, while ordinary civilization stumbled through cycles of violence, arrogance, and forgetting. That is a spiritual claim, a symbolic claim, maybe even for some readers a personal truth. But it is not the same as a historical claim. You can be moved by a text without believing its stated origin. You can treat Thoth the Atlantean as a mythic teacher without confusing him with the Thoth of excavated Egyptian religion. You can find meaning in warnings about human pride and collapse without concluding that a greenstone archive has been authenticated beneath the sands of Egypt. Those are different questions, and keeping them separate does not destroy the mystery. It tells us where the real mystery begins, because once the modern trail is clear, another puzzle opens up. Why did this particular story need Atlantis? Why did it place Thoth beneath the earth in halls of Amenti? And why does its lost world feel so much like a memory of catastrophe, survival, and forbidden knowledge carried across the ruins of time? Atlantis gives the tablets their catastrophe. Amenti gives them their hidden architecture. Put those two ideas together, and the story becomes more than a collection of mysterious sayings. It becomes a complete myth of collapse, survival, concealment, and return. In the tablet's own narrative, Thoth is an Atlantean. Not merely a god worshipped in Egyptian temples, and not simply a wise priest living in some distant age. He is a survivor of a civilization destroyed in a vast upheaval. Atlantis falls. The old land is swallowed. Its knowledge, its power, and its people vanish beneath the waters. But not everything is lost. Thoth survives, and like every great survivor in every flood story, he carries something through the destruction, not just his own life. Memory, knowledge, a warning. He travels to Egypt, or Kem, as the tablets call it. There he becomes teacher, builder, lawgiver, keeper of secrets. He instructs humanity after the fall of the old world. He preserves fragments of a wisdom that ordinary people are not yet ready to possess. And he creates, or gains access to, the halls of Amenti. This is the central image, not a library sitting in sunlight, not a temple open to pilgrims, an underground realm, a place beneath the surface of the world where ancient knowledge can outlast the destruction above it. The halls of Amenti are described as chambers of mystery, places connected to death, transformation, cosmic cycles, and beings whose lifespans extend far beyond ordinary human time. Thoth enters them. He learns from hidden masters. He encounters powers of light and darkness. He speaks of ways to overcome mortality, or at least to pass through death with awareness intact. The story is not subtle about what this means. Civilizations can die, continents can sink, humanity can forget almost everything. But beneath the ruins, somewhere inaccessible, the secret may still be waiting. And that idea has enormous power. Think about it. If knowledge is stored in a normal archive, fire can burn it. War can destroy it. Floodwater can carry it away. But if wisdom is hidden beneath the earth, guarded by immortal beings and accessible only to the initiated, then disaster does not get the final word. The surface world may collapse, but the deeper truth survives. That is the architecture of a lost world, a fallen civilization above, an eternal refuge below. But where did this architecture come from? Not from one ancient Egyptian source, not from Plato alone, and not from any verified Atlantean record. It is a modern synthesis built from older materials. Start with Atlantis. The oldest surviving detailed account of Atlantis comes from the Greek philosopher Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE. In the dialogues Timaeus and Critias, Plato describes a powerful island civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules, usually identified with the Strait of Gibraltar. Atlantis is wealthy, technologically impressive, militarily ambitious, and morally corrupted. Then, after earthquakes and floods, it disappears into the sea. That is Plato's Atlantis. And it matters that Plato frames the story through Egypt. In his dialogue, Egyptian priests are said to possess records of an ancient catastrophe unknown to the Greeks. So, from the beginning, at least in the version that survived, Atlantis and Egypt were already linked in the imagination. But Plato never says that Thoth was an Atlantean survivor. He never describes greenstone tablets. He never gives us the halls of Amenti. Those features arrive much later. By the 19th and 20th centuries, Atlantis had escaped from Plato's dialogues and become something much bigger. Writers and occult teachers transformed it from a philosophical story into a prehistoric global civilization. Atlantis became the mother culture behind Egypt, India, the Americas, and nearly every ancient mystery people wanted explained. Theosophy played a major role in this transformation. Helena Blavatsky and later theosophical writers described humanity moving through immense cycles of spiritual development. They wrote of vanished continents, ancient races, hidden adepts, secret initiations, and civilizations far older than conventional history allowed. In these systems, catastrophe was not random. It was part of a cosmic rhythm. Worlds rise, worlds decay, worlds are purified, and fragments of higher knowledge are carried into the next age. That is very close to the emotional universe of the tablets. The language may differ from author to author, but the pattern is recognizable. Ancient masters, cycles of decline, hidden centers of wisdom. Knowledge preserved from a previous world. Humanity forgetting its true inheritance. The tablets place Thoth at the center of that pattern. He is the bridge. He connects Atlantis to Egypt, the world before disaster to the world after it. Lost science to sacred wisdom, human mortality to the promise of spiritual ascent. And then there is Amenti. This name sounds Egyptian because it is Egyptian, or at least it resembles Egyptian religious vocabulary. Ancient Egyptians used terms connected with Amentet, meaning the West, for the realm associated with the dead. The West was where the sun disappeared each evening. It was the direction of tombs, burial grounds, and the passage into the next life. But this is where caution matters. Ancient Egyptian religion had a rich and complicated underworld geography. There was the Duat, the realm through which the sun travelled at night. There were fields of reeds, gates, caverns, judges, gods, dangerous beings, and blessed dead. There were funerary texts that mapped the journey after death in extraordinary detail. But the halls of Amenti in the modern tablets are not simply a translation of a known Egyptian place. They are a reimagining. They borrow the authority of Egyptian death language, then combine it with occult initiation chambers, hidden master traditions, subterranean mysteries, and the modern fantasy of a secret archive beneath the ruins of history. Similarity is not proof of continuity. A text can use Egyptian names without being ancient Egyptian. It can mention Kem, Thoth, the West, hidden halls, sacred words, and cosmic balance without preserving a lost temple doctrine. In fact, modern esoteric writing often works exactly this way. It takes real ancient terms and gives them new roles inside a new spiritual system. That does not make the system worthless. It makes it historically identifiable. The ancient Egyptian Thoth was deeply associated with writing, calculation, records, language, lunar timekeeping, ritual knowledge, and divine order. He was the one who measured, the one who counted, the one who recorded the result when a dead person's heart was weighed against Ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, and right order. Those associations made him ideal for later reinvention. If you wanted a guardian of forbidden wisdom, who better than the god of writing? If you wanted a witness who could remember what humanity forgot, who better than the divine recorder? If you wanted an immortal teacher who could carry knowledge across a flood, who better than a figure already linked to sacred texts, cosmic measurement, and the preservation of order? So the modern Thoth of the tablets is not unrelated to Egypt. But he is not identical to ancient Egypt either. He is Egypt transformed by centuries of Greek interpretation, Hermetic tradition, alchemy, romantic fascination, occult revival, and lost civilization speculation. And that may explain why these stories never disappear. Every generation has its own Atlantis. Sometimes it is a warning about pride. Sometimes it is a dream of forgotten technology. Sometimes it is a protest against the idea that modern civilization knows best. Sometimes it is a hope that the world was once wiser, more unified, more spiritually awake than it is now. Lost civilization stories endure because they turn history into a mirror. They let us imagine that our own world is not the first world to become powerful, divided, arrogant, or blind to danger. They suggest that someone has already made our mistakes, that the ruins beneath the waves are not only ruins, they are evidence. Evidence that knowledge without wisdom can destroy a civilization. Evidence that memory is fragile, and evidence, or at least hope, that something worth saving can survive the flood. But if something survives the flood, what exactly is it trying to tell us? This is where the tablets become more interesting than a simple lost continent story, because the central warning is not really, a giant flood happened once. It can happen again, not necessarily the same way. Not necessarily through water. The tablets speak in a language much wider than one disaster. They speak of darkness falling over the world, of civilizations breaking apart, of powerful knowledge placed in the hands of people unable to use it wisely, of humanity rising, becoming proud, losing balance, and then being brought down by forces it no longer understands. That is the pattern: rise, forgetting, corruption, upheaval, survival, recovery, then rise again. The text repeatedly presents Thoth as someone standing outside ordinary human time. He remembers ages that other people have forgotten. He has seen lands vanish. He has watched cultures rise and collapse. He speaks to later humanity almost like a witness from a previous cycle. Someone who knows that confidence is temporary because he has already seen the confident world disappear. And that is why the tablets feel like a warning. Thoth is not just preserving secrets because secrets are exciting. He is preserving them because memory is fragile. People forget what destroyed the world before them. They inherit fragments of knowledge, but not the discipline that made that knowledge safe. They receive power without understanding its limits. Then they make the same mistake. This is one of the deepest ideas in the text. Civilization does not fall only because nature becomes violent. It falls because human beings become spiritually blind. They lose contact with balance, with truth, with the order of the cosmos. In Egyptian terms, you might think of Ma'at, the principle of rightness, harmony, justice, and proper measure. But the tablets are not simply repeating ancient Egyptian theology. They are building a modern esoteric vision around a similar fear. The fear that intelligence alone is not enough. You can build cities. You can master tools, you can gather wealth, you can learn how to command natural forces. But if wisdom fails to grow alongside power, then power becomes dangerous, and eventually destructive. That is the Atlantis lesson, as the tablets tell it. The old civilization was not destroyed merely because it was unlucky. It was destroyed because something had gone wrong within it. The language is often vague, mystical, and symbolic. Darkness, shadows, the sons of Belial, forces of disorder. Hidden powers turning knowledge toward domination rather than enlightenment. You can interpret these figures literally as supernatural enemies in the story's own universe, or you can read them as symbols of greed, violence, pride, the desire to possess power without accepting responsibility for what that power does. Either way, the message is clear enough. A civilization can be brilliant and still be doomed. In fact, the more powerful it becomes, the more dangerous its failures may be. That is why the tablets do not work very well as a straightforward flood chronicle. They do not give us dates we can test, rivers we can identify, layers of sediment we can excavate, or a reliable historical sequence leading from a drowned Atlantis to dynastic Egypt. The catastrophe is real inside the mythic narrative, but it is not described with the kind of detail historians would need to treat it as a record of a specific ancient event. The flood matters, but it is not the only thing that matters. It is part of a larger vision of recurring upheaval. The tablets speak as though the universe itself moves in cycles. Light and darkness, life and death, descent and return. Humanity rises toward knowledge, then falls into ignorance. The old masters disappear. Sacred teachings are concealed. Ages pass. And eventually, someone finds the hidden door again. It is almost like the halls of Amenti are not only underground chambers. They are the memory of civilization itself, a sealed vault beneath the noise of the present. Above ground, kingdoms rise and fall. Cities become dust. Names are erased. People argue about what is true, then die without knowing how much has already been forgotten. But below in the tablet's imagination, knowledge waits. Not dead, not destroyed, waiting for the right person, in the right age, to recover it. That is a powerful myth because it speaks to a very real historical fact. Human societies do forget. They forget languages, they forget techniques, they forget trade routes, religious ideas, political systems, and entire ways of organizing life. The collapse of a state can scatter scribes, burn archives, empty cities, and break the institutions that pass knowledge from one generation to the next. Later, people may live among ruins without knowing who built them. They may find old objects and assign them meanings their makers would never recognize. We have seen versions of this throughout history, but the tablets take that ordinary human vulnerability and enlarge it to cosmic scale. Forget one craft and a city suffers. Forget wisdom and the world resets. That is the apocalyptic rhythm beneath the text. Not one final end of history. Not a single judgment after which nothing continues. A cycle, a warning repeated because humanity is always in danger of becoming the civilization that forgets. And that is also where readers need to be careful. It is tempting to open the tablets, find their talk of darkness and catastrophe, and treat every ambiguous line as a prediction of modern disaster. Climate collapse, nuclear war, earthquakes, solar storms, a coming flood. People have done this with ancient prophecies for centuries. We are very good at finding ourselves inside vague warnings, but the tablets do not provide a clear timetable for the future. They do not give us a scientific forecast. Their language is symbolic and esoteric, shaped by the spiritual world of the early 20th century, when ideas about lost continents, hidden masters, cyclic ages, and cosmic evolution were everywhere in occult writing. That context matters. A passage about darkness does not automatically describe an eclipse, a pole shift, or a global blackout. A passage about waters does not automatically preserve eyewitness memory of a prehistoric megaflood. A passage about cycles does not automatically predict that modern civilization is scheduled to end on a particular date. Reading it that way may make the story more dramatic. But it also makes the text say more than it actually says. The stronger reading is also the more unsettling one. The tablets do not warn that one specific disaster is definitely coming. They warn that no civilization is permanent. They warn that knowledge can survive only if people choose to preserve it. They warn that power without restraint can turn against the people who worship it. And they warn that the greatest danger may not be the flood itself. It may be the forgetting that comes after. Because once a society forgets how fragile it is, once it decides that its wealth proves its wisdom, once it mistakes technical power for moral progress, it may already be walking into the same darkness it believes belongs only to the past. And if that sounds familiar, it should. Long before the modern Emerald Tablets imagined Atlantis sinking beneath the waves, ancient Egypt had its own ways of thinking about water, chaos, destruction, and the terrifying possibility that order could fail. But did ancient Egypt actually have a flood myth? The answer is more complicated than most people expect. If by flood myth you mean a story like Genesis, where a god decides humanity has become corrupt, sends water over the entire world, destroys nearly everyone, and preserves a chosen survivor, then Egypt does not give us a clear equivalent. There is no Egyptian Noah, no famous ark packed with animals, no single canonical account of the whole earth disappearing beneath water. No one story repeated across Egyptian temples and funerary texts saying that humanity began again after a universal deluge. And that absence matters because Egypt is constantly associated with water. The civilization existed because of the Nile. Its fields, cities, temples, wealth, and political power all depended on a river that rose every year, spilled across the floodplain, and left behind dark, fertile silt. Without that annual inundation, much of Egypt would have been desert. So when modern readers find Egyptian texts full of waters, floods, submerged lands, primeval oceans, or chaos rising from below, it is easy to make a leap. Water equals flood. Flood equals destruction. Destruction equals the same story found in the Bible, Mesopotamia, Greece, India, and everywhere else. But ancient Egyptian religion does not work that simply. For Egyptians, the flood was not automatically an image of the end of the world. It was also the reason the world continued. Every year, the Nile seemed to perform a miracle. During the hottest part of the year, when the fields were dry and the landscape could look brutally lifeless, the river began to rise. Water spread over the land. The boundaries between riverbank and field vanished. Then, as the water withdrew, it left new soil behind. Crops could be planted. Food returned. Life returned. The inundation could be dangerous, of course. A flood that was too low could mean famine. A flood that was too high could damage homes, destroy stores of grain, and wash away the work of an entire season. Egyptian officials watched the water level closely, because the height of the Nile could shape the fate of the kingdom. But the basic pattern was not apocalypse, it was renewal. Think about how different that is from a tradition in which water is mainly the weapon of divine judgment. In Egypt, water was dangerous because nature was dangerous. But it was also sacred because it made civilization possible. The river did not simply threaten Egypt from outside. It ran through the centre of Egyptian life, bringing both uncertainty and abundance. That changes the symbolism. A rising water can mean chaos. It can mean danger. It can mean the loss of familiar boundaries. But it can also mean rebirth. It can mean the beginning of creation. And this is where the Egyptian idea of the primeval waters becomes crucial. Before there was land, before there was sky, before the sun crossed the heavens, before the gods took their places, and before human beings existed, Egyptian creation traditions often imagined an endless dark expanse of water. This was none. Not the Nile exactly, not an ordinary sea, not a geographical location ancient Egyptians could sail to. Nun was the unformed deep, the limitless waters that existed before the ordered universe. No fields, no temples, no kings, no measured time. Just potential without shape, existence before structure. Then, according to different Egyptian creation accounts, something emerged. A first mound rose from the waters, like dry land appearing after the Nile receded. A creator god appeared upon it, or brought himself into being. From that first emergence came light, air, moisture, earth, the gods, and eventually the ordered world humans knew. That is not a flood story in the usual sense, it is a creation story. The waters are not arriving to destroy a completed world. They are there before the world has been made. They are the condition from which order must be drawn. And yet none never completely goes away. That is the unsettling part. The ordered universe exists, but it exists surrounded by the possibility of disorder. Every sunrise has to be renewed. Every king has to defend justice. Every ritual has to help maintain the balance between the created world and the chaos beyond it. The waters of none remain beneath, around, and before everything. They are not evil in a simple sense. They are necessary, ancient, and powerful. But they are also what civilization must never allow to take over. This is one reason Egyptian religious language can sound apocalyptic to modern ears. A text may speak about the waters, darkness, the undoing of forms, or a return to a state before creation. And someone reading through the lens of Noah or Atlantis may hear an eyewitness account of a global deluge. But that may not be what the Egyptian text is saying at all. It may be describing the cosmos in symbolic terms. It may be talking about death, when the individual returns to a more primordial state before being reborn. It may be talking about the nightly journey of the sun through darkness. It may be talking about political collapse when matter fails and the world seems to slide back toward chaos. Or it may be describing creation itself, the first moment when stability rose out of the unbounded deep. Ancient Egyptian texts were comfortable with layers of meaning. Water could be the Nile, it could be the heavens, it could be the underworld. It could be death, it could be birth, it could be the first substance of creation. It could be the terrifying possibility that order is never as secure as it appears. That does not mean Egyptians had no stories of catastrophe. They absolutely did. They imagined divine anger. They imagined humanity failing in its obligations. They imagined disorder spreading through the land. They imagined a time when the structures that held life together could crack apart. But their strongest catastrophe traditions do not usually begin with a giant river overflowing the whole planet. They begin with something deeper. What happens when the order of the world is broken? What happens when humans rebel against the gods? When truth collapses? When violence replaces justice? When the king can no longer protect the balance he is supposed to embody? For Egypt, the great danger was not always water itself. The great danger was the return of chaos, and water was one of the oldest, richest, and most powerful ways to imagine that chaos. And that is why none matters so much. None was not simply water, not a river, not an ocean, not the Mediterranean beyond Egypt's northern coast, and not the Red Sea to the east. Nun was water before water had a shoreline, the limitless, dark, undifferentiated deep that existed before the first dawn, before the sun, before the stars, before the separation of sky and earth, before names, boundaries, kingdoms, gods in their familiar forms, and human beings living between the Nile and the desert. To an Egyptian thinker, none was not somewhere far away. It was everywhere beneath the visible order of things. Picture the world as ancient Egyptians often imagined it. Above you the sky arches overhead. Below you the earth stretches out as solid ground. The Nile runs through the land bringing life. The sun travels across the heavens by day, then passes through the hidden darkness by night before being born again at dawn. But surrounding that entire ordered system is none. The waters before creation, the waters beyond creation, the waters that were never fully defeated because they cannot be defeated. They are older than the gods who rule the created world, older than Egypt, older than time itself, and this is where modern readers can get confused. When Egyptian texts speak of an endless flood surrounding the world, they are not necessarily preserving a memory of a literal flood that covered every mountain and destroyed every civilization. They are describing the structure of reality as they understood it. The world was an island of order in an immeasurable sea of potential. That is a very different idea. In one major Egyptian creation tradition, associated especially with Heliopolis, the creator god Atum comes into being within none. He rises from the primeval waters, often connected with the first mound of dry land, emerging from the deep. From there creation unfolds, air is separated from moisture. Sky is lifted from earth. The divine generations appear. The world becomes differentiated. This is the crucial word, differentiated. Before creation, there is no clear distinction between one thing and another. No land separated from water, no day separated from night. No living person separated from the dead. No civilized world separated from wilderness. Everything exists in an unformed state, full of possibility, but without structure. Then creation gives things their places. The sky goes above. The earth goes below. The sun follows its path. The Nile rises and falls in its season. Gods receive their roles. Humans receive theirs. The king protects the land. Justice is maintained. Offerings are made. The dead are buried properly. Fields are measured. Temples are supplied. That ordered arrangement was what Egyptians called ma'at. Ma'at is often translated as truth, justice, balance, order, harmony. But none of those English words quite captures it. Ma'at was the right functioning of the universe. It was the reason the sun rose. The reason the Nile could nourish the fields. The reason families, communities, and kingdoms could endure. And none stood on the other side of that order, not always as an enemy. That is important. None was not Satan. None was not pure evil. The primeval waters were sacred. They were the source from which creation emerged, and the source from which renewal could emerge again. Every dawn echoed the first creation. The sun rising from darkness was not just another morning. It was a replay of the moment when light first appeared over the waters. Every year, when the Nile spread across the floodplain and then withdrew, leaving fertile earth behind, it could recall the first mound rising out of the deep. Every birth, every regeneration after death, every new king taking the throne could be understood as another victory of form over formlessness. But there was a darker side to this. If order had to be made, then order could fail. If the world had emerged from none, then, in some ultimate sense, it could return to none. That possibility appears in Egyptian funerary literature. In a famous passage from the Book of the Dead, the creator Atum speaks of a time when the created world will be undone. What he has made will return to the condition of none. The language is not a newspaper report from the future. It is cosmic speculation, a vision of dissolution at the far edge of time. And it is unsettling, because it means creation was never imagined as permanently secure. The world was stable, but its stability required maintenance. Ritual maintenance, moral maintenance, political maintenance, cosmic maintenance. Every day priests performed temple rites. They washed divine statues, presented food and incense, spoke sacred words, and reaffirmed the relationship between gods, king, land, and people. This was not just ceremony for ceremony's sake, at least in the religious logic of Egypt. These actions helped hold back disorder. Every king was supposed to do mat and repel Isfet, the Egyptian term often translated as chaos, injustice, falsehood, or disorder. A failed harvest, invasion, civil conflict, tomb robbery, corruption in office, neglected temples, violence between neighbours, these were not isolated problems. They could be signs that the balance was breaking. Think of it like a dam holding back an enormous body of water. The dam is not weak because water exists. It is useful because water exists. It channels force. It creates life. It makes irrigation and settlement possible. But if the dam cracks, the same force becomes destructive. That was the Egyptian relationship with the waters of Nun. The deep was the source of all life, but also the permanent reminder that life was vulnerable. Beneath every field, every temple, every royal monument, every carefully drawn boundary, lay the possibility of boundaries dissolving. This is why Egyptian religion is so obsessed with renewal. The sun must be reborn, the dead must be restored. The king must renew the covenant of order. The Nile must rise in the proper measure. The universe itself must be continually defended against collapse. And once you understand that, Egyptian references to water start sounding less like fragments of one lost global disaster and more like parts of a much larger philosophy. A philosophy shaped by the Nile, certainly, by a landscape where water could erase the borders of fields, then restore fertility when it withdrew, but also shaped by the basic human realization that civilization is fragile. That order is constructed, that it can vanish faster than people want to believe. Could a real flood have contributed to this imagery? Local floods, destructive inundations, failed Nile seasons, storms and regional disasters absolutely belong to Egyptian experience. Egyptians did not need a planet-wide deluge to understand what water could do, but there is no archaeological or geological evidence for a single historical flood that covered the entire Earth in the way later universal flood stories describe. And the Egyptian image of Nun does not require one. Nun is not evidence that Egypt remembered Noah's flood before Noah. It is evidence that Egypt remembered something more universal and in a way more frightening. Before every wall, there was open space. Before every law, there was uncertainty. Before every kingdom, there was the deep, and beneath the confidence of temples, kings, and eternal monuments, Egyptians understood that the world had once been unmade. It could be unmade again. The question was not whether chaos existed. The question was whether humanity could keep feeding it. And that question leads directly into one of Egypt's darkest stories, a tale in which humanity turns against the sun god himself, and divine punishment comes terrifyingly close to wiping the human race away. This is the story known today as the Book of the Heavenly Cow, and it begins with a terrifying idea. The human race decides that the sun god has grown old. Ra, the creator and ruler of the world, has governed since the first age. But now people whisper against him. They mock him. They question his authority. In some versions, they plot rebellion in secret, convinced that an aging god can be challenged. This is not a story about humans making an innocent mistake. This is humanity choosing revolt against the order that keeps the world alive. And Ra hears about it. Imagine the fear built into that moment. The sun god is not merely a king with an army. He is the force that brings daylight, the power behind creation, the ruler whose journey across the sky makes life possible. If Ra withdraws, the world does not just lose a government. It loses the sun, so Ra calls the other gods into council. He summons them in secrecy, gathering the divine powers around him, including Nun, the ancient waters that existed before creation. And this detail matters. Even Ra, the great creator, turns back to Nun for counsel. The old deep is still there, still watching, still older than the ordered world. The gods advise Ra to send his eye against humanity. The eye of Ra is not just an eyeball floating through the air. In Egyptian religion, it is a divine force, often appearing as a goddess. It protects Ra, it sees threats, it punishes enemies, and when it is sent out to deal with human rebellion, it takes on one of the most frightening forms in the Egyptian pantheon, Sekhmet. Her name can be translated as the Powerful One. She is lion-headed. She is associated with heat, plague, war, destruction, and the scorching force of the sun. She is not evil in the simple modern sense. She is divine power with the restraints removed, the violence needed to destroy what threatens cosmic order. Ra sends her down, and Sekhmet begins killing. The text is brutal. Humanity is struck down. Blood runs across the land. Sekhmet becomes intoxicated by the slaughter, driven by a force that even the gods begin to fear. The punishment is working too well. That is the central horror of the story. The rebellion of humanity is dangerous, but divine anger once unleashed may be even more dangerous. Ra wanted the rebels punished. Sekhmet is close to annihilating the species. Think about what that means in Egyptian terms. This is not the destruction of one corrupt city, not one wicked king being overthrown, not even one region suffering famine or invasion. It is a near-extinction event. The human world is on the edge of being erased because it has turned against Ma'at, the balance that holds creation together. And then at the last possible moment, Ra stops it. But he does not defeat Sekhmet with a weapon. He uses beer. The gods prepare enormous quantities of beer, mixed with red ochre or another red substance, until it resembles blood. During the night, they spread it across the land where Sekhmet will find it at dawn. She sees the red flood, and she thinks it is blood. She drinks. She drinks until she becomes drunk, too drunk to continue the killing. The destroyer is transformed. Her rage subsides. Humanity survives. It is one of the strangest rescue scenes in ancient religious literature. The fate of the human race turns not on a heroic battle, not on a righteous survivor building a vessel, but on dyed beer spread across the earth. And yet the story is not comic. It is a warning. Humanity has been spared, but it has not returned to the world it knew before. Ra is exhausted by human rebellion. He no longer wishes to remain close to them. He withdraws from the earth. In the continuation of the myth, the sky goddess Nut takes the form of a great cow and lifts Ra upward, carrying him away from the human realm. The god of the sun is now separated from the world below, travelling across the heavens rather than ruling directly among humans. This is why the text is called the Book of the Heavenly Cow. The image explains more than the shape of the sky. It explains a changed relationship between gods and people. The first age is over. The time when the Creator was immediately present has ended. Humanity remains alive, but it now lives at a distance from divine power. That is a very Egyptian kind of catastrophe. The world does not end completely. The sun still rises, the Nile still flows, kings still rule. Temples still perform their rites, but something fundamental has been broken. Human beings have proved themselves capable of rebellion. The gods have proved capable of wiping them out, and the distance between heaven and earth becomes part of the price of survival. There are also ritual echoes in the story. Egyptian festivals associated with Hathor, another goddess who could overlap with Sekhmet in some traditions, included drinking, music, celebration, and intoxication. Later readers sometimes saw these festivals as recalling the moment when beer saved humanity from divine slaughter. But we should be careful here. This is not an Egyptian version of Noah's flood. There is red liquid covering the ground, yes. There is a threatened destruction of humanity, yes. There is divine judgment and only a remnant-like human survival. Those parallels can feel familiar because flood traditions around the world often ask the same enormous question: what happens when human behavior becomes so destructive that the world must be cleansed, reset, or punished? But the mechanism is completely different. No ark is built. No chosen family rides out a deluge. No universal flood destroys the world and then withdraws. In the Book of the Heavenly Cow, the danger is not water from heaven or chaos from the deep. The danger is divine violence. The red flood is a trick, a mercy disguised as blood used to stop the destruction before it becomes total. And that difference tells us something important. Egyptian myth was deeply concerned with catastrophe. It knew that humanity could threaten the balance of creation. It imagined the gods withdrawing protection. It imagined the species itself standing close to extinction. But its darkest warning was not that water would cover the world. It was that order could collapse when humans turned against it, and that even salvation might leave the world permanently changed. And that fear did not disappear with the Book of the Heavenly Cow. It shows up again and again in Egyptian literature, sometimes not as a myth about gods and monsters, but as something far more immediate. A country coming apart, fields empty, granaries bare, the rich becoming poor, the poor taking what once belonged to the rich, servants wearing fine linen, while noble families go hungry, violence in the streets, officials unable to govern, foreigners entering the land, the dead left unburied, the Nile itself seeming to fail. This is the nightmare world described in a famous Egyptian text usually called the Admonitions of Upheaval. And if you have ever seen it quoted online, you may have encountered a dramatic claim. Some readers say it is an eyewitness record of the biblical plagues. Others call it proof that Egypt remembered a prehistoric flood, a civilizational collapse, or some forgotten catastrophe that shook the entire ancient world. The text certainly sounds apocalyptic. It describes a land where everything has been turned upside down. Behold, the poor of the land have become rich, one passage declares. He who could not make sandals now possesses wealth. Elsewhere it says that those who once owned fine clothing are now in rags, while those who once had nothing are dressed in expensive linen. Social hierarchies have reversed. The old boundaries are gone. And that, for an Egyptian audience, was terrifying. Because ancient Egypt was built around a concept called Ma'at. Ma'at is often translated as truth, balance, justice, harmony, or order. But none of those words quite captures the whole idea. Ma'at was the condition that allowed the universe to function. It was the reason the sun rose on schedule, the reason the Nile flooded and then receded, the reason crops grew, the reason kings ruled, courts judged, families endured, and the dead could reach the afterlife. Ma'at was not just good behaviour, it was cosmic stability. Its opposite was Isfet, chaos, violence, falsehood, disorder, the state in which things no longer remain in their proper place. A king was expected to defend Ma'at against Isfet. Temple rituals helped sustain it. Laws were supposed to express it. Even ordinary moral behaviour, telling the truth, feeding the hungry, honouring the gods, was connected to the larger struggle. So when an Egyptian text imagines servants becoming masters, judges being powerless, food disappearing, and violence spreading through the land, it is not simply describing a bad year. It is describing the collapse of the world's operating system. If Ma'at fails, then one disaster does not remain one disaster. Famine leads to theft. Theft leads to violence. Violence destroys trust. Trust collapses institutions. Institutions fail to distribute food, defend borders, settle disputes, or maintain the rituals that keep gods and humans in balance. The breakdown feeds itself. Picture it like this. A flood can destroy a village. A drought can kill a harvest. An invasion can overthrow a king. But the collapse of Ma'at means there may no longer be anyone capable of rebuilding afterward. That was the deeper Egyptian apocalypse, and the admonitions of Upheaval gives that fear a voice. But here is where we have to slow down. The historical setting of the text remains uncertain. The surviving manuscript dates much later than the period it may be describing, and scholars have debated its meaning for generations. Was it based on memories of the political fragmentation after Egypt's Old Kingdom? Was it a literary composition set in an imagined time of chaos? Was it a political warning showing what happens when legitimate kingship fails? Or was it a mixture of social observation, poetic exaggeration, and religious anxiety? There is no simple answer. What we can say is that the text should not be treated like a modern newspaper report. It does not give us a clean date, a clear location, casualty counts, or a sequence of events that can be matched neatly to a known disaster. Egyptian literary texts often use extremes to make moral and political points. The world has to look almost unrecognizable, so that the restoration of order can feel necessary. This is catastrophe as argument. The writer is not necessarily saying, this is exactly what happened on a particular Tuesday. He may be saying, look what the world becomes when order is abandoned, and the images are unforgettable. The river is blood, the land is full of misery, gates, walls, and columns are burned. Children suffer. The powerful are humiliated. People who once had security are desperate. Those who cannot protect themselves are exposed to hunger and fear. You can understand why later readers saw disaster memories in passages like these. A river described as blood immediately reminds modern audiences of the Exodus story. Famine and social upheaval can sound like the aftermath of flood, drought, plague, war, or volcanic darkness. When a text says the entire land is overturned, it is tempting to imagine that some immense real event must stand behind it. And maybe, in the broadest sense, real hardships did shape the imagination that produced these texts. Ancient Egyptians knew famine. They knew failed Nile floods. They knew civil war, invasion, disease, political collapse, and the terrifying possibility that the king could not keep the land safe. But turning that possibility into proof is another matter. The admonitions of Ipuwer does not provide evidence for Noah's flood. It does not clearly record the 10 plagues, and it does not preserve a straightforward historical account of a single lost cataclysm. What it preserves, more reliably, is a civilization's fear of a broken order. And that fear was powerful because Egypt depended on regularity more visibly than almost any ancient society. The Nile had its rhythms, agriculture had its seasons. The king had his ritual responsibilities, the gods had their temples. When the system worked, life along the river could seem miraculously stable, renewed every year by water rising out of the south. But when that rhythm failed, the contrast was brutal. If you enjoy digging into these kinds of mysteries, the channel's book on 12 Unexplained Mysteries goes deeper into cases where history, myth, and unanswered questions overlap. You can find it through the website link in the description. Now, there is another important detail in these Egyptian disaster texts. They rarely stop at despair. Chaos is described so that order can be imagined again. In the admonitions, there are passages that seem to long for a ruler who will restore the land, drive out disorder, protect the weak, and put every part of society back where it belongs. Whether those lines were originally part of the same composition or attached later has been debated, but the larger Egyptian pattern is clear. The world can fall into Isfet, but it must be returned to Mart. That is different from many later apocalyptic traditions, where history moves toward one final ending. Egyptian thought was often cyclical. Every night the sun entered darkness. Every dawn it rose again. Every year the Nile withdrew and returned. Every king inherited a world that had to be defended anew against chaos. The apocalypse was always possible, but so was restoration. And maybe that is why Egyptian catastrophe language feels so ancient, so strange, and yet so familiar. It is not really asking whether one giant flood happened in the distant past. It is asking something more unsettling. What holds a civilization together? Not its monuments, not its treasure, not even its gods. if people abandon the obligations that connect heaven, earth, ruler and community. The real disaster begins when no one believes the order can be repaired. And once that fear enters the imagination, a river turning red, a famine, an invasion, or a rebellion can become more than an event. It can become a sign that the world is slipping back toward the waters of chaos from which it was first created. And that brings us to one of the most important distinctions in this entire story. Because Egypt did have ancient texts about chaos, sacred knowledge, cosmic order, divine writing, and the dangerous boundary between creation and destruction. But it did not leave us a confirmed set of green stone tablets written by Thoth before the flood. What it did leave, or rather what later cultures believed it had left, was something much smaller. Something called the Emerald Tablet, singular, not tablets. The real Emerald Tablet is one of the most famous texts in the history of alchemy. It is short, in some versions only a few lines long. It does not describe Atlantis, it does not tell the story of survivors escaping a prehistoric cataclysm. It does not contain the long speeches about Amenti, cosmic cycles, or an immortal Thoth travelling through hidden chambers beneath the earth. Instead, it reads like a compressed riddle, a formula for understanding how reality fits together. The text is traditionally attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a legendary sage whose name means Hermes, the thrice greatest. And one of its most famous lines is usually translated something like this: "That which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below." You may know it in its shorter modern form. As above, so below. It sounds ancient. It sounds Egyptian. It sounds like something carved into a temple wall before the pyramids were built. But the history is more complicated. There is no confirmed ancient Egyptian emerald artifact sitting in a museum that we can point to and say, this is the original tablet. No archaeological excavation has produced it. No inscription from pharaonic Egypt gives us the exact text in its familiar form. The earliest known versions appear in Arabic alchemical writings from the early medieval period, centuries after the last pharaohs had ruled Egypt. That does not make the text unimportant. It makes its real journey even more interesting. The Emerald Tablet entered the Latin-speaking world during the Middle Ages, when scholars in Europe were translating Arabic scientific, philosophical, and occult texts. It became attached to a whole body of writings known as Hermetic literature, texts supposedly preserving the wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus, and Hermes Trismegistus was himself a product of cultural fusion. When Greeks encountered Egypt, they saw similarities between their god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. Hermes was associated with writing, language, travel, messages, calculation, and hidden knowledge. Thoth was the divine scribe, the keeper of sacred words, the measurer of time, the recorder of judgment, the god who knew the names and numbers behind the visible world. To Greek and later Roman thinkers, these two figures seemed like reflections of one another. So Thoth became Hermes, and Hermes became Thoth. Then, over time, this combined figure grew larger than either god had originally been. He became Hermes Trismegistus, not simply a deity, but an impossibly ancient teacher, a priest, a philosopher, a magician, a master of astronomy, medicine, alchemy, and divine secrets. Someone who had supposedly lived before Moses, before the Greeks, perhaps even before the flood. That last part mattered for medieval and Renaissance readers. Ancient wisdom had authority. The older a text seemed, the closer it might be to the original truths of creation. If Hermes had learned from Egyptian priests, and Egyptian priests had inherited knowledge from a world before catastrophe, then Hermetic writings could appear to be fragments of humanity's first science, a message rescued from the ruins. The Emerald Tablet became one of the most concentrated expressions of that hope. Its language is deliberately mysterious. It speaks of the sun as father, the moon as mother, the wind carrying a thing in its belly, and the earth as its nurse. It describes separating the subtle from the gross, the pure from the impure, with care and intelligence. It promises the power to transform earthly matter. To an alchemist, this was not just poetry, it was an instruction manual written in code. Alchemy is often reduced to one famous goal, turning lead into gold. And yes, many alchemists did search for ways to transform base metals into noble ones, but alchemy was never only about money. It was also about purification, healing, the search for an elixir of life, the belief that matter itself could be refined, elevated, and brought closer to perfection. The laboratory and the soul were often treated as mirrors. If crude metal could become gold, perhaps a crude human being could become wise. If the visible world reflected invisible principles, perhaps studying nature was also a way of studying the divine. That is the deeper meaning behind as above, so below. Not necessarily that every event on Earth is controlled by stars, or that secret rulers are manipulating reality from another dimension. Those are much later interpretations. In its Hermetic and alchemical context, the phrase points to correspondence, a pattern repeated across levels of existence, the heavens and the earth, spirit and matter, the body and the cosmos. What happens in one realm may help explain what happens in another. Think of it like a map drawn at two different scales. A river on a small map is not the river itself, but its shape can tell you something about the larger landscape. Hermetic thinkers believed the human being, the laboratory vessel, the planet, and the heavens might all reveal versions of the same hidden order. That idea was enormously influential. During the Middle Ages, the Emerald Tablet was copied, translated, commented on, and treated as a source of ancient authority. In the Renaissance, when European scholars became fascinated by Greek and Egyptian wisdom, Hermes Trismegistus became almost legendary. Thinkers such as Marsilio Ficino translated Hermetic texts and believed they represented a primordial theology, an ancient spiritual truth shared before religions divided into separate traditions. Alchemists returned again and again to the tablet's phrases. They tried to decode its imagery. They searched for the one thing it seemed to describe, the mysterious substance capable of uniting opposites and completing the great work. Even when scholars later recognized that many Hermetic texts were written in the Roman era, not in the age of the pharaohs, the tablet's influence did not disappear. It had already helped shape Western esotericism, and its name carried power. Emerald Tablet. Just those two words create an image. A green slab. Secret writing. A relic that survived kingdoms, fires, floods, and the forgetting of humanity. It sounds less like a book and more like an object recovered from a sealed chamber beneath a ruined temple. That image is exactly why confusion became so easy. By the 19th and 20th centuries, occult writers were freely blending Egyptian gods, Greek Hermeticism, Atlantis stories, spiritualist teachings, reincarnation, lost continents, and secret brotherhoods. The historical Hermes, the Egyptian Thoth, and the imagined keeper of prehistoric wisdom began merging into one figure. Then came Maurice Doreal in the 1930s. Doreal published what he called the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, the Atlantean. These were not the brief alchemical verses known from Arabic and Latin tradition. They were long modern esoteric compositions written in English, presenting Thoth as an Atlantean priest-king who escaped destruction and carried secret knowledge into Egypt. The title did a great deal of work. Emerald Tablets. Thoth, Atlantis. Each word already carried centuries of mystery. Put them together, and the result felt ancient enough to stand beside Egyptian temples, biblical flood stories, and the oldest myths of civilization. But the connection is not historical evidence. It is a later construction. The real Emerald Tablet helped create the atmosphere. Its mysterious name, its hermetic authority, its promise that hidden laws connect heaven and earth, all of that gave later writers a foundation to build on. But Doriel's tablets are not the same text. They are not an expanded translation of the medieval Emerald Tablet. They are not a recovered Egyptian inscription, and they are not confirmed testimony from a world before the flood. They are part of a modern occult tradition that borrowed the prestige of a much older one. And to understand how that borrowing became possible, we have to follow the path back to the moment when the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek god Hermes became something new. A keeper of secrets with one foot in the temple, one foot in the stars, and another in the imagination of everyone who believed lost Egypt still had something to reveal. That transformation did not happen overnight. It began when Greek speakers entered Egypt in large numbers after the conquest of Alexander the Great in 332 BCE. Alexander died young, but one of his generals, Ptolemy, took control of Egypt and founded a dynasty that would rule for nearly 300 years. This was the world of Ptolemaic Egypt, Greek kings ruling in Egyptian land, Greek cities growing beside ancient temples, priests, merchants, soldiers, scribes, philosophers and travellers living in the same crowded cultural landscape. And when cultures meet, they start looking for familiar shapes in each other. The Greeks had a habit of identifying foreign gods with their own. Modern scholars call this interpretatio Graeca. It means Greek interpretation. If a foreign god seemed to govern storms, Greeks might compare him to Zeus. If a goddess seemed connected to love or war, they might compare her to Aphrodite or Athena. It wasn't always exact. It was more like translation. Not word for word, function for function. So when Greeks encountered Thoth, they saw a god who handled writing, language, calculation, sacred records, timekeeping, divine messages, and secret knowledge. Thoth was the scribe of the gods. He recorded the results when the dead stood before judgment. He measured the moon. He knew the power of names, spells, numbers, and correct speech. In some Egyptian traditions, he even helped sustain the order of the universe through knowledge itself. Now think about Hermes. Hermes was the Greek messenger god. He moved between worlds. He carried messages from Olympus to mortals and from mortals to the dead. He was connected with language, travel, trade, boundaries, cleverness, and the hidden roots that link one place to another. Later Greek traditions also associated him with learning, interpretation, and secret wisdom. The overlap was impossible to miss. Thoth knew divine writing. Hermes carried divine messages. Thoth measured the heavens. Hermes moved between realms. Thoth guarded sacred knowledge. Hermes was the guide through what was unknown, so Greek writers began identifying Thoth with Hermes, and Egyptian priests, who were perfectly capable of adapting old traditions to new political realities, could work with that identification too. It created a bridge, a way for Greek-speaking people to approach Egyptian religion without feeling they were entering a completely alien world. But then something bigger happened. The combined figure started to become more than either original god. He became Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice greatest. The title probably drew on Egyptian praise language used for Thoth, who could be called great, great, great. But in Greek, it became a name with enormous force. Not just Hermes, Hermes 3 times great, greatest in wisdom, greatest in power, greatest in knowledge of the heavens, the earth, and the divine. And gradually, Hermes Trismegistus stopped being only a god. He became a legendary teacher, Imagine a name that could carry the authority of an Egyptian temple priest, a Greek philosopher, an astronomer, a magician, a healer, and an ancient prophet all at once. That was Hermes Trismegistus. Different writers imagined him differently. Some treated him as divine. Others treated him as a human sage who had received divine revelation. Some placed him in the distant Egyptian past long before Greek civilization. Later readers pushed him even farther back, before Moses, before history, before the great disasters that supposedly wiped earlier knowledge from the world. That is how a god of writing became the imagined author of humanity's oldest secrets. The writings associated with this figure are called the Hermetica. They include philosophical dialogues, religious revelations, astrological texts, magical manuals, and alchemical traditions. The most famous collection is usually called the Corpus Hermeticum. In these texts, Hermes speaks to students, often a figure named Tat, sometimes Asclepius. He explains the nature of the cosmos, the human mind, God, fate, stars, death, rebirth, and the possibility that human beings contain a spark of something divine. The ideas can sound strikingly Egyptian. There are visions of a living cosmos filled with divine power. There is reverence for the sun, the stars, sacred speech, and the hidden structure beneath visible reality. There is also a deep concern with purification, spiritual awakening, and escaping ignorance. But the language of most surviving Hermetic dialogues is Greek, and the world behind them is not pharaonic Egypt frozen in time. It is Hellenistic and Roman Egypt, a world where Egyptian temple traditions still survived, but where Greek philosophy, astrology, mystery religion, and later Roman imperial culture had become part of the same intellectual ecosystem. Think of Alexandria not just as a city with a famous library, but as a pressure chamber, Egyptian priests preserving ancient ritual knowledge, Greek philosophers debating the nature of reality, astronomers mapping the skies, Jews translating scripture into Greek, merchants bringing ideas from across the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Near East. In that environment, religious ideas did not stay separate for long. They mixed. They borrowed each other's language. They created new forms. The Hermetica are products of that mixing. Most scholars date the major philosophical Hermetic texts to roughly the first few centuries of the Roman Empire, although they may preserve older Egyptian and Greek ideas. That still makes them ancient, very ancient. Some were written almost 2,000 years ago. But ancient is not the same as primordial. They are not confirmed texts from the Old Kingdom. They are not inscriptions written by a literal Thoth in the age before dynastic Egypt. And they do not provide evidence that Egyptian priests possessed a surviving archive from Atlantis or from a flood that erased an earlier global civilization. Their real history is more grounded than that, and, in some ways, more fascinating. These texts show what happened when people living in Egypt tried to explain ultimate reality using more than one inheritance at once. Egyptian sacred knowledge gave the tradition depth. Greek philosophical language gave it new tools. The result was a figure who could speak across cultures, Hermes with the face of Thoth. That fusion turned Egypt into something larger in the imagination of the ancient world. Egypt was already old to the Greeks. Its temples seemed impossibly ancient. Its monuments were older than most Greek cities. Its priests had records, rituals, astronomical traditions, and sacred languages outsiders could barely understand. To a Greek or Roman visitor, Egypt could feel like a civilization that remembered what everyone else had forgotten. Hermetic literature intensified that feeling. It suggested that behind the temples, behind the hieroglyphs, behind the statues of animal-headed gods, there was a hidden philosophy, a secret science of the soul and the stars, Not merely stories about gods, but knowledge of how the universe was built. And once that idea took hold, it became almost indestructible. Even after the old temples closed, even after knowledge of hieroglyphs was lost in Europe, even after scholars could no longer read the inscriptions carved across Egyptian monuments, people continued to believe Egypt was guarding a buried revelation. A wisdom older than Greece, older than Rome, maybe older than the flood itself. That belief would pass through late antiquity, the Islamic world, medieval Europe, Renaissance magic, alchemy, Freemasonry, occult revival movements, and eventually the modern legends of hidden chambers, Atlantean survivors, and Emerald Tablets. Not because the evidence proved Egypt held a literal prehistoric archive, but because Hermes Trismegistus made the possibility feel believable. He gave secret knowledge a name, and he gave that name an Egyptian home. And that idea, wisdom older than the flood itself, leads us away from Egypt for a moment and east toward Mesopotamia. Because if we want to find the oldest surviving written flood traditions, we do not begin with Noah. We begin in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, the land of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, a place where cities rose from river mud, where floods could be life-giving one year and catastrophic the next, and where scribes pressed stories into wet clay thousands of years before the Bible reached its final form. This is where the flood story becomes impossible to ignore. There are three names to remember: Ziusudra, Atrahasis, and Utnapishtim. Different languages, different literary settings, possibly different versions of a much older tradition. But all three are connected to a terrifying idea. The gods decide that humanity must be destroyed by a flood. One man is warned, a vessel is built, life survives, and the world begins again. First comes Ziusudra, the Sumerian figure. His name means something like life of long days. He appears in a damaged Sumerian text often called the Eridu Genesis. The surviving manuscript is incomplete, which is frustrating because it may preserve one of the earliest written flood accounts we have. It was copied in the early 2nd millennium BCE, though the story itself may be older. In what remains, the gods decide to send a flood. The reasons are partly lost in the broken lines of the tablet. But one god, Enki, associated with fresh water, cleverness and hidden knowledge, warns Ziusudra. He tells him to build a huge boat, then the flood comes. The text breaks apart just when we want it most, but Ziusudra survives. He offers sacrifice, and the gods grant him extraordinary life, placing him in a distant, almost paradise-like land. Already the pattern is there: divine decision, chosen survivor; sealed vessel, destruction; sacrifice, restoration. Then comes Atrahasis. Atrahasis is an Akkadian name meaning exceedingly wise. His story survives in old Babylonian copies from roughly the 18th century BCE, that places the written evidence many centuries before the earliest surviving manuscripts of Genesis, even though the biblical traditions themselves clearly drew on older oral and written material. The Atrahasis epic begins before the flood. Humanity is created to take over the labour of the lesser gods. At first, this arrangement works, but humans multiply. They become noisy. Their activity disturbs the god Enlil, ruler of the air and one of the highest gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon. So Enlil tries to reduce humanity first through plague, then drought, then famine. Each time, the god Enki quietly helps humans survive. But eventually Enlil demands something final, a flood that will erase mankind completely. Enki cannot openly defy the divine decision, so he does something wonderfully Mesopotamian. He speaks to a wall, or rather, he speaks through a wall to Atrahasis, allowing the wise man to overhear the warning without technically breaking his oath. Build a boat, leave your possessions, save life, bring aboard your family, animals, and the living things needed to begin again. The flood arrives with devastating force. The storm is so violent that even the gods are terrified. They retreat to heaven and cower like dogs. Then, after the waters subside, Atrahasis offers a sacrifice. The gods gather around the smell of roasted food because in this story the destruction has left them without the humans who provided offerings. It is a strange detail, but it tells us something important. These were not abstract stories about a single all-powerful god judging the whole world. They came from a polytheistic world, a world where gods argued, panicked, made mistakes, and depended, in some sense, on human beings. And then there is Utnapishtim. His story appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the great Mesopotamian poem about a king searching for immortality. Gilgamesh meets Utnapishtim at the edge of the world and asks the question every human being eventually asks. How did you escape death? Utnapishtim answers by telling him about the flood. In this version, the god Ea, another name associated with Enki, warns Utnapishtim. He gives detailed instructions for a massive boat. The vessel is built, sealed with bitumen, loaded with family, craftsmen, animals, and the seed of all living things. The storm lasts for days. The world disappears beneath water. Then Utnapishtim releases birds. A dove, a swallow, and finally a raven, which does not return, because it finds dry land. When he emerges, he offers sacrifice. The gods smell it. Enlil, initially furious that anyone survived, is eventually reconciled. Utnapishtim and his wife receive a gift no ordinary human can keep: immortality. Now compare that structure with the story of Noah. A divine decision to destroy humanity, a righteous or chosen man. A warning, a great vessel built according to divine instruction. The preservation of family and animals, flood waters covering the land, birds sent out to test whether the earth is dry, a sacrifice after survival, a renewed order between humanity and the divine. The similarities are too close to dismiss as coincidence. But they do not mean the biblical story is simply a copied Mesopotamian tale with names changed. The differences matter too. In Genesis, the flood is tied to human violence and corruption, not noise. God is not one squabbling figure among many. Noah is not granted immortality. And the covenant after the flood, marked by the rainbow, gives the story a moral and theological shape unlike its Mesopotamian predecessors. Still, Mesopotamia is central to any serious discussion of flood mythology, because the clay tablets are there. Not imagined tablets, not hidden tablets. Actual tablets, excavated, translated, compared line by line. They show that long before later esoteric writers linked Egypt, Atlantis, Thoth, and lost worlds, the people of Mesopotamia were already preserving memories of destruction and survival in writing. And they were asking the same question that would echo through every later flood story. When the world is washed away, who gets remembered? But Mesopotamia is not the whole world. Once you start looking, flood stories appear almost everywhere. In Greece, in India, in China, across the Americas, across the islands of the Pacific. And at first, the pattern can feel overwhelming. A world destroyed by water, a warning, a survivor. A boat, a mountain, an animal, a new beginning. It is tempting to look at all of this and say, there it is. Proof that humanity remembers one single global flood. But this is exactly where we have to slow down, because flood stories do recur. The similarities are real, but the differences are real too. And those differences may tell us more than the similarities. Take Greece. The Greek flood story centers on Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha. In one well-known version, Zeus decides that humanity has become wicked and must be destroyed. Prometheus, the clever titan who gave fire to mankind, warns his son Deucalion. Deucalion builds a chest or ark. The rain falls, the rivers rise. Most humans perish. After 9 days the vessel comes to rest, often on Mount Parnassus. Deucalion and Pyrrha emerge into an empty world. Then they receive a strange instruction from an oracle: throw the bones of your mother behind you. They realize mother means earth, and her bones are stones. They throw stones over their shoulders. Deucalion's stones become men. Pyrrha's become women. That is not Noah. It is not Utnapishtim. It is a Greek story about survival, yes, but also about rebirth from the earth itself. Humanity is not preserved through pairs of animals and a covenant. It is remade from stone. Then there is India, where the flood story is connected to Manu. In the Shatapatha Brahmana, a text composed over many centuries and preserved in later manuscripts, Manu finds a tiny fish asking for protection. Manu saves it, first in a jar, then in larger and larger bodies of water as it grows. Eventually the fish reveals that a great flood is coming. Build a boat, it says, take seeds. When the waters rise, tie your vessel to my horn. The fish, later identified in Hindu tradition with Vishnu in his Matsya form, pulls Manu through the flood until the boat reaches safety on a northern mountain. Then Manu performs a sacrifice, and from that act comes renewed life. Again, there is a warning: a vessel, a survivor, a mountain. But the heart of this story is different. The saving power is not a god secretly undermining other gods. It is divine preservation arriving in the form of a fish. And Manu is not simply escaping judgment. He becomes a founder, a lawgiver, an ancestor for the human world that follows. China offers something different again. Chinese traditions contain many stories of devastating floods, but they do not always describe the destruction of all humanity. One of the most important is the story of Gun and Yu. The waters are out of control, covering the land, disrupting crops, settlements, and the entire human order. Gun tries to stop them by building barriers and fails. His son Yu succeeds through a different strategy. He does not defeat the flood with one giant boat. He channels it. He dredges rivers, cuts passages through mountains, organizes labor across vast territories. After years of work, Yu brings the waters under control and becomes the legendary founder of the Jia dynasty in later tradition. That matters. This is not primarily a story about one family surviving the end of the world. It is a story about engineering, political order, and the hard work of making a flood-prone landscape habitable. Across the Americas, the diversity becomes even clearer. In some Andean traditions recorded after the Spanish conquest, a great flood called Unu Pachacuti destroys a previous age of humanity. Viracocha sends the waters, and a small number of people survive in places of refuge. But the story belongs to an Andean cycle of world renewals, destruction, and recreation. In some North American indigenous traditions, flood narratives involve animals diving beneath the water to bring up a little mud from which new land is formed. Among several communities, the details differ sharply, but the theme is not always punishment. It can be cooperation. The muskrat, loon, turtle, or other small being succeeds where stronger animals fail. The world is rebuilt through effort shared between humans, animals, and spiritual powers. And in the Pacific, where communities lived with cyclones, tsunamis, rising seas, and the constant force of the ocean, flood traditions often carry the memory of island landscapes and dangerous water. Hawaiian traditions tell of Nu'u, who survives a great flood in a vessel and offers sacrifice afterward. Other Polynesian traditions describe floods differently, sometimes as local disasters, sometimes as conflicts among gods, sometimes as transformations of particular islands rather than the whole planet. So what are we seeing here? One possibility is diffusion. Stories travel. They travel with merchants, migrants, conquerors, captives, priests, and families. Mesopotamian ideas could move into the Eastern Mediterranean. Greek stories could absorb influences from older Near Eastern traditions. Biblical flood traditions emerged in a world already connected by trade, war, and shared literary culture. This is not speculation in every case. We can actually trace some connections. The relationship between Mesopotamian and biblical flood traditions is too close to ignore, but diffusion cannot explain everything. A flood is one of the most obvious disasters human beings can experience. Rivers overflow, storms erase villages, coastal waves destroy entire communities in minutes. Melting snow, monsoon rains, dam failures, hurricanes and tsunamis can make the world feel as if it has ended, especially when your world is one valley, one river plain, one island, one homeland. And then there is storytelling itself. Human beings use disaster stories to ask moral questions. Why do societies collapse? Who deserves to survive? What knowledge must be carried forward? Can order return after chaos? A flood is powerful because it wipes away boundaries. Fields disappear, roads disappear. The familiar world becomes one endless surface of water. You do not need one planet-wide event to explain why that image appears again and again. Maybe some stories preserve memories of real regional catastrophes. Maybe some were shaped by contact with older traditions. Maybe some emerged independently because water has always been both the source of life and one of its greatest threats. Probably, across the world, all three happened. That is less dramatic than a single lost civilization, drowned beneath every myth. But it is far more human, and it brings us back to Egypt, where the deepest flood was not always a historical disaster at all. Sometimes it was the water that existed before the world began. But that does not mean the geological world is irrelevant, because long before anyone wrote down Gilgamesh, Noah, Manu, or the stories of drowned islands, human communities were living through disasters that could change the shape of memory itself. Picture a village beside a river. For generations, the river has been predictable. It rises in its season, leaves fertile mud behind and retreats. People build homes near its banks because water means crops, fish, transport, life. Then one year the rains do not stop. The river rises beyond every mark anyone remembers. It tears through fields, carries away animals, collapses houses made of mud, brick and wood. Families climb onto roofs, hills, trees, anything above the water. By the time it ends, the old village is gone. To the survivors, this is not a local inconvenience. It is the end of the world they knew, and that is the key. Ancient people did not need a flood covering the entire planet to create a story about a world drowned beneath water. Their world was the landscape that fed them, sheltered them, buried their ancestors, and gave meaning to their lives. If that landscape vanished, even temporarily, the catastrophe could become cosmic in memory. River floods are the most obvious example. The Tigris and Euphrates could be life-giving, but they could also be violent and unpredictable. Archaeologists have found flood deposits at some ancient Mesopotamian sites. But they do not all date to the same moment, and they do not prove one single flood destroyed the entire region. What they show is something more realistic. Communities in southern Mesopotamia lived with repeated devastating inundations. A flood at one major city could become a story told for centuries. Then that story could travel. It could be joined to another flood, another king, another god, another tradition. Over time, a regional disaster could become the flood. The sea could do something even more dramatic. At the end of the last ice age, beginning roughly 20,000 years ago, the planet warmed. Great ice sheets melted, and sea levels rose by more than 120 meters over thousands of years. That number is hard to feel until you imagine what it means on the ground. Coastlines moved inward, lowlands disappeared, river valleys became estuaries. Plains where people had hunted, gathered plants, buried their dead, and passed stories from one generation to the next were swallowed by water. Areas now beneath the North Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the waters of Southeast Asia were once dry land or vast coastal landscapes. For people living through it, this was not one sudden global wave. It was usually a slow transformation unfolding across many lifetimes. Grandparents could remember a marsh. Their grandchildren might know open water. A hunting route became a shoreline. A shoreline became a dangerous crossing. But sea level rise was not always smooth. There were periods of rapid change. Storm surges could push farther inland. Tsunamis could erase coastal settlements in a single afternoon. Earthquakes could drop sections of land below the sea. In places where the land itself was sinking, the water would seem to be advancing with terrifying purpose. And memories of such events may survive in stories, not necessarily as precise geological reports. Oral traditions are not archives in the modern scientific sense. They do not preserve dates with laboratory accuracy. They preserve what a community decides matters. The place was once dry. The sea came in. People ignored a warning. A few escaped. The old world lies beneath the water. Those are not coordinates on a map. They are meaning compressed into narrative. This is why some researchers have looked at traditions of drowned lands and wondered whether they contain very ancient memories of post-ice age sea level rise. In Australia, for example, some Aboriginal traditions describe coastlines and islands that appear to reflect landscapes altered thousands of years ago. These possibilities are fascinating, but each case has to be studied carefully. Similar stories can arise for many reasons. A tradition may preserve a genuine memory, but proving exactly which event inspired it is extraordinarily difficult. The Black Sea flood hypothesis shows why caution matters. In the late 1990s, geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed that rising Mediterranean waters may have catastrophically breached into the Black Sea basin around 7,600 years ago. In the most dramatic version of the theory, a massive wall of water poured through what is now the Bosporus, rapidly transforming a lower freshwater lake into a much larger saltwater sea. It was an arresting idea. Some people immediately wondered whether it could be the origin of flood traditions, even perhaps a distant ancestor of the Noah story. But the evidence remains debated. Researchers agree that the Black Sea changed profoundly as sea levels rose after the Ice Age. What remains uncertain is exactly how fast, how catastrophic, and at what stages those changes occurred. Was there one enormous sudden inundation, or a more complex sequence of rising water, changing shorelines and regional transitions over time? The answer matters because myths are easy to attach to dramatic events after the fact. A hypothesis can be plausible without being proven, and even if a sudden Black Sea flood did occur, linking it directly to a particular written myth, thousands of years later would require evidence we simply do not have. That is the limit we have to respect. Geology can tell us that seas rose, rivers shifted, volcanoes erupted, and tsunamis struck. Archaeology can sometimes show us settlements abandoned, shorelines moved, fields buried under sediment. But neither discipline can automatically tell us what people said around their fires afterward. And myths, however ancient they feel, rarely come with a date stamp. Still, the connection does not have to be all or nothing. A flood myth does not need to be a literal eyewitness account to contain the emotional truth of disaster. It may carry the memory of many floods, layered together across centuries. It may preserve a landscape no longer visible. It may turn a drowned village into a drowned kingdom, a regional storm into divine judgment, a family's escape into the survival of humanity itself. That is what oral tradition does. It changes details in order to preserve significance. Names shift, gods change, the geography expands, the dates disappear. But the warning remains: water can take everything. The world can become unrecognizable, and survival depends on who listens, who prepares, and what knowledge they carry forward. Which may be why texts like the Emerald Tablets feel so convincing to modern readers. Not because they offer a verified message from before every flood, but because they speak the language disaster has always created: lost ages, hidden wisdom, cycles of destruction, and the terrible possibility that humanity has forgotten what earlier survivors learned. That feeling is not an accident. The Emerald Tablets are built to feel older than history. They do not speak like a normal modern book. They speak in proclamations, commands, warnings, fragments of wisdom delivered by a voice that seems to stand outside ordinary time. I, Thoth, listen and understand. Seek not the forbidden. Light and darkness, cycles within cycles. This is the language of initiation. The reader is not treated like someone opening a book. They are treated like someone crossing a threshold. You are told that hidden knowledge exists. You are told that most people cannot handle it. And then, crucially, you are told that you may be one of the few capable of receiving it. That is powerful, because once a text makes you feel like an initiate, skepticism can start to feel like failure. If something does not make sense, maybe it is too deep. If the history does not line up, maybe the truth has been suppressed. If the source cannot be checked, maybe that is proof that it was meant to remain hidden. The text turns its own lack of evidence into part of the mystery, and the Egyptian imagery makes that mystery even stronger. Thoth was not a random invented name. In ancient Egyptian religion, Thoth was genuinely associated with writing, calculation, language, record-keeping, sacred knowledge, and the measurement of time. He was the divine scribe, the keeper of words that could outlast kings. So when a modern esoteric text claims to come from Thoth, it borrows the authority of a real ancient tradition. Then it adds the perfect setting: secret chambers beneath pyramids, halls of Amenti, lost Atlantean survivors, tablets hidden in inaccessible places, manuscripts translated by unnamed custodians, knowledge passed through private initiations rather than public libraries. Notice what all these claims have in common. They are almost impossible to verify. You cannot inspect a tablet sealed in a hidden chamber. You cannot compare a secret original with a published translation. You cannot ask an ancient brotherhood for its archive if the brotherhood is said to operate beyond public view. Every missing piece becomes another layer of protection around the story. And that creates a strange kind of authority. Normally, historical claims become stronger when more people can examine them. A museum preserves the object. Archaeologists document where it was found. Epigraphers study the language. Other scholars challenge the conclusions. The evidence is not weaker because people question it. It becomes stronger by surviving questions, but hidden history narratives reverse that logic. The less accessible the evidence is, the more sacred it can seem. A lost manuscript becomes more exciting than a preserved one. A secret translation seems more important than a translation with footnotes. An inaccessible location sounds more convincing than an excavated site, because the inaccessible location leaves room for anything. There could be gold there. There could be machines. There could be records from before the flood. There could be nothing at all. And the human mind is extremely good at filling empty spaces with the thing it most wants to find. This is where confirmation bias enters the story. If you already suspect that civilization is older than historians admit, the tablets can feel like confirmation. If you believe ancient Egypt inherited knowledge from Atlantis, every reference to hidden halls becomes a clue. If you think floods erased a global civilization, then warnings about cycles of destruction sound less like spiritual allegory and more like eyewitness testimony. The problem is, a text can fit a belief without proving it. That distinction is everything. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We connect dots. Sometimes that ability saves lives. A rustle in the grass might mean a predator. Dark clouds might mean a storm. But the same instinct can lead us to connect things that only resemble each other. A flood myth, a submerged coastline, an Egyptian god of writing, and a modern occult text can form a compelling pattern. Compelling is not the same as confirmed. Now, none of this means the tablets are meaningless. A story can be historically unverified and still carry symbolic truth. The descent into hidden chambers may speak to the fear that wisdom has been lost. Atlantis may represent civilization's arrogance, the idea that power without moral balance destroys itself. Thoth may symbolize the human need to preserve knowledge against catastrophe. The warning about cycles may express something real about history. Societies do forget, institutions do collapse, and people repeatedly discover that progress does not make them invulnerable. That can be personally meaningful. It can even be profound. But personal meaning is not historical authentication. A message may change your life and still not come from ancient Egypt. A symbol may express a deep truth and still be created in the 20th century. The question, "What does this mean to me?" is not the same as the question, "Where did this text come from?" So, how do you evaluate a claim like this? Start with the simplest question. What is the earliest verifiable appearance of the text? Not where does it claim to come from, but when can we actually document it? Then ask, is there a physical original? Where was it found? Who excavated it? Is there a chain of custody? Can independent experts examine it? Next, look at the language. Does it match the period it claims to represent? Does it use concepts, names, or ideas that emerged much later? Then separate the evidence into categories. What is documented? What is plausible? What is speculative? And what is simply asserted? Finally, ask the question that hidden history stories most often try to prevent. What evidence would change my mind? If the answer is none, then we are no longer investigating history. We are protecting a belief, and that is the real reason the tablets feel ancient. They speak to ancient fears, ancient hopes, the terror of losing the world, the dream that someone, somewhere, saved the knowledge before the waters came. So, after all the hidden chambers, Atlantean survivors, emerald records and warnings from before the waters, what is left? More than you might think, but not what the modern tablets claim. The Emerald Tablets attributed to Thoth are not verified artifacts from ancient Egypt. There is no excavated set of green stone inscriptions carrying their text. No Egyptian manuscript preserves the story of Thoth fleeing Atlantis, building the halls of Amenti, or leaving a secret record for the survivors of a world disaster. The version people share today enters the historical record in the 20th century, presented through modern esoteric channels, not through archaeology. That part is clear, and it means the answer to the biggest question is also clear. No, the Emerald Tablets of Thoth do not predate every flood myth we know. They do not predate the Mesopotamian stories of Ziusudra, Atrahasis, and Utnapishtim. They do not predate Egyptian religious texts. They do not stand behind Noah as some forgotten original source. The documented evidence puts them thousands of years later than the ancient flood traditions they are often said to explain. But ancient Egypt did preserve a warning. just not that one. The Egyptian warning was not usually a single flood destroyed the first civilization. It was that order is fragile. The Egyptians called that order Ma'at, truth, balance, justice, right relationship between people, gods, land, king, and cosmos. Ma'at was what kept the sun rising, the Nile returning, crops growing, courts functioning, families surviving. It was not just an abstract moral principle, it was the structure that kept chaos from swallowing the world. And chaos was always waiting. The Egyptians called it isfet, disorder, violence, falsehood, famine, rebellion, cosmic breakdown. In their stories, the world did not have to end once and forever. It could come apart again and again. The Nile could fail. Enemies could invade. Kings could become unjust. People could forget their obligations. The boundary between the living world and the primeval waters of none could become dangerously thin. That is the real Egyptian apocalypse, not necessarily a giant wave. Not a buried super-civilization, a breakdown of the systems people depend on until the world they know no longer holds together. And this is where Thoth still matters. The real Thoth was a god of writing, measure, calculation, language, and record-keeping. He counted time. He recorded judgments. He preserved names. In a civilization that understood how easily human life could be erased by death, disaster, and political collapse, writing was more than communication. It was resistance against forgetting. A name written down could survive its owner. A ritual copied correctly could survive a generation. A measured calendar could help people prepare for the return of the river. Knowledge had power, but it also carried responsibility. It had to be preserved, transmitted, and used in balance with Ma'at. Maybe that is why the later tablets chose Thoth. They borrow the authority of a god whose deepest meaning was never secret power for its own sake. It was the careful keeping of what must not be lost, and flood stories remain powerful for the same reason. They do not need to come from one vanished civilization to speak across cultures. Communities living near rivers, coasts, lakes, and monsoon zones knew that water gives life and takes it away. They saw storms erase fields. They watched rivers cross boundaries that had seemed permanent. They inherited memories of real local catastrophes, then shaped those memories into stories about human failure, divine judgment, survival and renewal. Different cultures told different versions. That difference matters. But the fear beneath them is recognizable everywhere. What happens when the world that keeps us alive suddenly stops behaving as it should? The modern tablets answer with hidden masters and ancient survivors. Egypt answered with Ma'at. Protect the balance, remember the laws, keep the records, because civilization is never as permanent as it believes. And that may be the warning that survives the investigation. Because in the end, the question is not really whether every ancient story can be traced back to one original catastrophe. It can't, not with the evidence we have. The modern Emerald Tablets of Thoth cannot be established as a source older than the flood myths of Mesopotamia, Egypt, or the Hebrew Bible. They are not a recovered message from before Noah. They are not a documented Egyptian record from Atlantis. Their specific story appears in the modern world, shaped by esoteric writers drawing on older names, older symbols, and humanity's oldest fears. That doesn't make them meaningless. It just means we have to understand what kind of meaning they carry. A story does not need to be ancient to reveal something ancient in us. The tablets speak about lost knowledge, cycles of destruction, civilizations falling into darkness, and a few survivors carrying wisdom forward into a new age. Those ideas may not come from a literal green stone record hidden beneath Egypt, but they resonate because people have always lived with the possibility that everything familiar can disappear. A river changes course. A harvest fails, a city burns. An empire collapses. A generation grows old, and the things it knew are not passed on. Then, a few centuries later, people stand among the ruins and wonder who built this, what they believed, and how so much could have been lost. That is not fantasy, that is history, and ancient Egypt understood it deeply. Egyptian religion was not built around one final end of the world. It was built around the daily struggle to keep the world from coming apart. Every sunrise mattered because the sun had to defeat darkness again. Every Nile inundation mattered because the land depended on a rhythm that could not be taken for granted. Every ritual, every calendar, every written name, every judgment in a court was part of the larger effort to preserve Mat against Isfet, order against chaos, memory against oblivion. The Egyptians knew that creation itself had emerged from the dark, limitless waters of Nun, and they knew those waters were never entirely gone. They remained at the edges of the ordered world, beneath it, around it, waiting beyond the boundaries that human beings tried so hard to maintain. That image is powerful because it is true in more than one way. Civilization is never as solid as it feels from inside. It rests on seasons, rivers, trust, knowledge, cooperation, and memory. Remove enough of those things, and even the greatest society can begin to look temporary. Maybe that is why flood myths endure. Maybe some preserve distorted memories of real disasters. River floods, coastal inundations, storms, tsunamis, drowned settlements, landscapes changed so completely that survivors could barely explain what had happened. Maybe some preserve fears, the fear that nature is bigger than us, the fear that the structures protecting us are fragile, the fear that one terrible season can undo the work of generations. Or maybe they preserve moral lessons, that arrogance has consequences, that leaders can fail, that balance can be broken, and that survival depends not only on strength, but on foresight, cooperation, and the willingness to begin again. Probably, in many cases, it is all three: events, fears, lessons, not a single universal memory, copied perfectly from one civilization to another, but many communities trying to make sense of danger with the language they had: gods, waters, judgment, rescue, renewal. And perhaps that is the deeper warning behind Thoth, Egypt, and every story of a world nearly lost. We do not only forget facts, we forget vulnerability. We forget that the systems sustaining us were built by people, maintained by people, and can be neglected by people. We forget that knowledge has to be copied, taught, tested, and protected. We forget that records matter, that names matter, that the past is not safely stored away just because we assume it is. Then, when something breaks, we call it unimaginable. But the ancient world rarely did. They imagined it constantly. They turned it into myth, ritual, prayer, law, and memory. Not because they wanted disaster to happen, but because they understood that remembering danger might help them survive it. So no, the Emerald Tablets of Thoth do not give us a verified warning from before every flood myth we know. But the investigation still leaves us with something real. A warning from Egypt. A warning from Mesopotamia. A warning from every people who watched the waters rise and asked whether their world would return. Remember what keeps the world together, and remember how quickly it can be forgotten. If you enjoyed this journey into the Emerald Tablets, ancient Egypt, and the flood myths that still haunt human memory, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below. Do you think these myths preserve real events, human fears, moral lessons, or all of them at once? And let us know where you're listening from. It's always fascinating to see how far these old stories travel. And if you want to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify using the link in the description.